I'm Justin Glawe, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey, what's up? Justin Glawe here with American Doom, and today I'm talking with Max Flugrath of Fair Fight, which is a voting rights advocacy group. The reason we're talking is not just because the House passed the SAVE Act last week, which could make it more difficult for 21 million Americans to register to vote, but because, as I reported also last week at Rolling Stone, the SAVE Act is just a part of a massive strategy by Republicans across the country to make it more difficult to register to vote, to make it harder to vote, and to do all sorts of things that the election denial movement has been calling for years. Today I'm catching up with Max on all of that. If you want to follow my work and support it, you can head over to american-doom.com. That's my Substack newsletter, and the best way to support my work is through a paid subscription, or you can drop a few dollars into our coffee fund. Let's get started. All right, Max, thanks for joining me. It is not an election year, but there's still like a lot of stuff going on. In fact, this has been one of the busiest beginnings of legislative sessions as far as election administration goes in the last 4 years. So, it seems like the movement is like doubling down on a lot of this stuff as opposed to taking the win, right? They won the White House. They've got Congress. Tell me sort of like what are some of the big things that you and Fair Fight are keeping an eye on as all these bills continue to roll in across the country.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And you're absolutely right. Donald Trump won the election, giving election deniers, new power in the White House to try and push their agenda forward. They have both houses of Congress, and they're moving forward in that area. They did pass the SAVE Act through the House, which is now going to the Senate. A lot of the smart money out there, people are saying it's effectively dead in the Senate. They don't think it's going to move. Chuck Schumer was actually on a podcast last week, and he said, it'll pass over his dead body, which is encouraging to a lot of people who care about free and fair elections, that Democrats in the Senate are standing up so strong against this bill. But as you said, there are still threats out there. There are a bunch of like copycats of the SAVE Act, like state level versions that are making their way through legislatures in Texas, in Florida, in other states as well. There was one actually that was passed in New Hampshire, and it took effect in the March local elections. And several people there were turned away from the polls because they didn't meet the requirements, even though, they're U.S. citizens, they're eligible voters, and they just wanted to make their voices heard in the election. And interestingly enough, specifically, there was, I believe, one woman that was turned away because of the issue that we see in the SAVE Act, which is, married women who have changed their name. So their name, now that they're married, does not match their name on their original birth certificate. There was a woman in New Hampshire, I believe, that was turned away for that reason. So we're keeping an eye on those SAVE Act copycats that are moving through the states. There are also things happening here in Georgia, although this legislative session was the first one since post-2020 election that they did not pass any bad anti-voter legislation. But there was two bills moving through that would have given much more power and influence to the state election board, which, you've reported on this at length, is a board dominated by, literal Trump ally election deniers who are trying to change law and disregard, established norms and rules and guiding principles of free and fair elections.
And give themselves more power. More power. I mean, what's so crazy about the state election board in Georgia is it is an unelected body of people who are getting more and more and more involved in the nuts and bolts, not just of election administration, but voter eligibility challenges, all sorts of stuff. Continue, please.
Also, this connects to that big story that you had published earlier this week in Rolling Stone. But, what we're seeing really is, a national sprawling movement. Well, not movement, but sort of like a plot, a scheme, a strategy take shape. You have people like Cleta Mitchell who are, writing these policies and are working with actors like the Heritage Foundation, like ALEC, to, create these really bad anti-voter bills like the SAVE Act. And others that are moving in Congress, moving to the legislatures. But, people like Cleta Mitchell have their arms even here in Georgia. Last year, she kind of facilitated Julie Adams being put on the Fulton County local election board here.
Yep.
Julie Adams then was integral in trying to pass a rule change that would have allowed local elections officers like her, local elections officials like her, to sort of block certification or contest certification or obstruct it. They just wanted to muddy things up and gum it up. But you're seeing kind of the sprawling tentacles of this movement now make itself known throughout the country and all the ways these election deniers are trying to shape things. And the election board is just one example of how it's not through legislation. It's not necessarily through the White House, but it's through, odds and ends of election administration that they are trying to really derail the process and, stop elections from being free, fair, and really democratic. It's an attack on democracy on multiple fronts.
It's so interesting, and thank you for I reported on Julie Adams' involvement with Cleta Mitchell's Election Integrity Network, and I had completely forgotten that, honestly, because there is just so much that is happening, especially in Georgia, in Fulton County, at the state election board, in the legislature, obviously, and that's just one state. And so multiply that times, a lot of other states, and there's just so much to keep track of. But, as you were talking, I'm struck by the sort of incredible nature of the fact that Cleta Mitchell is like the most powerful election administration person in the country, really, in a lot of ways, right? Like it's basically like her and then like a bunch of actual election officials like Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes and other people who are fighting her. But here is this woman who, 5 years ago or whatever it was during the 2020 election, I mean, she was like an out there fringe sort of, she was in that crew of like Sidney Powell, L. Lynn Wood, Mike Flynn people. And now it's gotten to the point where she's working with the Heritage Foundation. She's working with the American Legislative Exchange Council, which drafts up all these bills for overworked legislators in all of these states to just, what do we call them? We call them dummy bills, or we call them
model legislation.
There you go. Model legislation. They can just copy and paste their state's name into it. And
many have forgotten to remove ALEC placeholder language from these bills when they filed them.
Right.
Actually, just so it's a comically transparent peek behind the curtain.
Right. And that's what's so crazy about it, is that like the look behind the curtain is that Cleta Mitchell is running the show, right? From these from everything from the Fulton County Election Board all the way up to the House of Representatives, where when the House passed the SAVE Act last week, there was Chip Roy from Texas, who was one of the authors of the SAVE Act, thanking and congratulating none other than Cleta Mitchell herself for all of her great work on the SAVE Act. So she's just this massively powerful figure in this movement that like no American asked for Cleta Mitchell's involvement in how their elections are run. And yet here she is. I want to get back to the SAVE Act real quick and some of the copycat stuff, and especially some of that stuff that you mentioned about some places where this copycat legislation has passed. And there's like a lot of noise out there about, is the SAVE Act actually that bad? Well, what's wrong with requiring people to prove that they're citizens to vote? And I have a very basic, dumb question, which is that like, didn't at some point in my own personal voter registration process have to prove that I'm a citizen? And I don't have to necessarily bring my birth certificate every time I go vote, right? So like, why is it that we are having to sort of prove this again through things like the SAVE Act and the copycat legislation that we're seeing? Or am I wrong about that? Is it possible that me as Justin has never proven my citizenship to register to vote, I guess is my question.
Well, in most states, you have to use some form of ID to register to vote. A lot of states integrate it with their DMV. When you go to update your license, when you go to apply for a license, you're also registered to vote. And so, it's all built on a myth, really, that non-citizens, that people who are not U.S. citizens are voting in large numbers and, changing the outcome of elections. It's all BS.
Yeah.
Even the Heritage Foundation did, a comprehensive 20-year study on this, looking back at state data. And in about 2 billion with a B, votes cast over the past 20 years, they found just 85 cases where people who are not citizens voted in elections.
And by the way, there was a ton of these lawsuits that were brought in the final weeks and months leading up to the election. And I haven't had time to go back and look where all these lawsuits stands, but I have a feeling that a lot of them are just kind of dead in the water, right? But all these Republican groups across the country brought all sorts of lawsuits alleging that not only were there potentially millions of undocumented immigrants who were registered to vote, but that they had evidence that they had actually voted, right? And that was like, it took a long time for those lawsuits to get to the point where these Republican groups, including the Republican National Committee, actually made the claim, we have evidence of undocumented immigrants voting. Because I remember covering that in the lead up to the election. And when it finally got to that point, I was like, whoa. This is big. Like, this has never happened before. It's always been, there's a bunch of non-citizens on the voter rolls and blah, blah, blah. But it was never, they had evidence of them voting. And like, what happened to that evidence? You know what I mean? Like, it is all built on this. I mean, it's not even a myth, right? Like, it's just a lie. Like, they're just lying and saying
propaganda.
That. Yeah,
it's one thing to say, on social media or on TV, non-citizens are voting. It's another to, be in court filing lawsuits about these things where you are required to show evidence, proof, and not doing it. So I'd say, to anyone who's confused by this, who wants to know the truth, look to what they're doing in court. Are they putting these things behind their lawsuits as evidence? If they're not, they know it won't hold up. That's why they're not doing it.
So break down why the SAVE Act and these copycat bills are so problematic, not just because they're based on a lie, but like how they can actually affect regular people, people who are totally legal and citizens and all that good stuff. How is it potentially going to affect those people in a negative way if the Senate passes it, or if your state, if you're wherever you're listening to this from, passes a copycat version of the SAVE Act, because that's kind of what the plan B is, right?
Yeah. So first, to understand this, you really got to understand what modern day voter suppression looks like. And the person that I think puts it best is Dr. Carol Anderson. Here in Atlanta, she's a professor at Emory. And she essentially says that, we don't really have mass physical intimidation, mass violence, like back in the Jim Crow era. What we have now is a form of bureaucratic violence. They use the administrative state. They use rules, procedures, administration, different details, and laws, right, to just essentially make things more and more and more inconvenient, to the point where most people with their busy day-to-day lives, they got kids, they got work, they got responsibilities around the house and family. Maybe they just won't make it to the polls this time because they got so much going on, and now they have to go find their birth certificate. Now they have to go to a new polling location. Now they have to request their absentee ballot in a different time. Now they have to whatever it is, whatever the new thing that they're trying to do.
Now they can't mail in a ballot. Now they have to go vote in person on a single day on a Tuesday between the hours of 9 and 5, right?
Exactly. And so take that framing now and apply it to the SAVE Act, right? It's essentially requiring a new hurdle, even though we know only eligible Americans vote and there's not widespread voting by people who are not citizens. They want to add a new hurdle, and that hurdle is documentation that most people don't have. 21 million Americans do not have these documents. Mostly they are people who are people of color. They're Black folks, they're brown folks. They're mostly working class folks, a lot of rural people. They don't have these documents. So to get them now, they either have to somehow find them, you got to go to your parents' house, ask where your birth certificate is, or you got to.
Is it certified? Right? By the way, is it certified then? I mean, I remember having to do some passport stuff at one point in the last few years, and I had my actual birth certificate from the day I was born 41 years ago from the hospital. And I was like, hey, here you go, passport office. And they were like, no, this doesn't count. And I'm like, this is the birth certificate. What? Like, this is
How is that not certified?
I don't know. But then I had to like mail some stuff back to Illinois. It took weeks, right? And that's one of these hurdles that you're describing potentially.
Exactly. I had a passport issue as well. A couple of years back, I submitted my passport to the right time to renew it, but it took a lot longer, and I needed it because I had to go to a wedding, and I was the best man in the wedding. But even then, I was submitting it. I was working the process in the right timeline, and still, it was just delayed, delayed, delayed. So if you now take this and apply it to as a requirement for eligible Americans to express their fundamental right to vote, it's voter suppression, plain and simple.
And you know what? I can't believe I'm just now. This is why one of the reasons why I like talking to you, because you help me to think of things. But I'm just now recalling all of the passport stuff that is currently going on with trans Americans right now, and I can't help but wonder if this is part of the sort of othering of trans people and even married women. You could have a passport right now that has your former, your maiden name, and then you go to register and you go, okay, whatever, I got my passport. You go to vote and it doesn't match up, right? Now you have to go through the State Department, which passport stuff takes a long time to do, so those are
right. I mean, that's about national security and making sure people are who they say they are. That makes sense. But for voting, we know only eligible Americans are voting. So the only real reason to introduce this new hurdle is to stop people or just make it more and more inconvenient to dissuade them from voting. And
they must
think about the timing of this too, right? We're coming up. It'll be here before we know it. 2026 midterm election season. Trump is crashing the economy with his tariffs, with his insane policies, and Republican MAGA politicians, they want to avoid accountability at the ballot box. So what do? They introduce new hurdles that make it more difficult and more inconvenient for everyday people to vote them out.
Right. And if they don't get it done, then the states can introduce their own versions of this stuff, which is, by the way, that is sort of the again, I think part of the plan B aspect of this is obviously they would love for the SAVE Act to pass the Senate. It becomes federal law. All the states have to comply, which then we're in not just a whole new world in terms of it's more difficult to register to vote and to do all these things. But now every state has to enact all of these policies and find ways for their local, voter registration office to know what documents work, which ones don't work. It's a mess, right? It'll be a mess heading into a pivotal election year. And so to compound that mess, right, the other part of if we can't do it, let the states do it, plan B, I think, is the elections executive order that Trump issued the week before.
Yeah, which is another vehicle, right? It's
another
the same objective.
Right. And the top of that order is a documentary proof of citizenship provision, right? That's at the top of it. So if the SAVE Act doesn't work, okay, the executive order is still there. It's legally unclear exactly, states basically have to voluntarily submit to complying with that order or something. And
it's very
maybe
much,
the Trump administration will. Right. Maybe the Trump administration will sue states who don't do it. So it all seems like it's just a big sort of mess heading into
on the EO,
an election year.
Real quick, just to note for anyone paying attention to this stuff, a judge said that she will issue a ruling on several legal challenges to this elections executive order by this coming Thursday, April 24th. So something to watch for and see. Undoubtedly there could be appeals after that. So, but it's definitely an important thing to keep an eye on.
To bring this back full circle, I mean, let's also point out that elections executive order was basically a wish list of Cleta Mitchell and the election denial movement. I mean, it had everything that they wanted in it, right? Documentary proof of citizenship, essentially trying to do away with voting machines, right? How many times have we heard this over the last few years? All hand counted paper ballots and a single election day. Tell me a little bit about more of kind of what you thought when you saw that list of things that was in that order, comparing it to what we know the movement wants.
Yeah, I think it's just throw everything at the wall, see what sticks, right? So like you said, it's almost a wish list of election denier priorities, everything from the documented proof of citizenship to effectively ending voting machines, which would essentially create a paper ballot system, which has been long priority of many of these election denier folks who still believe the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. And we can get down into the weeds about like what paper ballots would mean, what they would do to election administration, insane amount of delay and confusion they would cause. But beyond that,
well, wait, Max, France does it. Haven't you heard that France does paper ballots? This is something that you'll hear Garland Favorito and all the other Georgia election deniers bring up every time the paper ballot thing.
I find that really interesting because the right in general seems to have a heavy disdain for anything that Europe is doing. So it's an interesting time to pick and choose, what government systems you want to model yourself off of. But one thing that I think is underlooked at beyond the whole Doge aspect of the executive order, which is nuts. It gives, essentially it gives Elon Musk, who, his roots are in apartheid South Africa. It gives him the power to essentially decide who's American enough to vote, which is ludicrous for so many reasons.
Right.
Yeah. It essentially targets states who accept mail ballots from overseas voters. And those can just be, Americans who live overseas. They can also be Americans serving in the military who are stationed overseas. But, it's been long-standing precedents that states accept ballots from these folks who are living overseas that are postmarked by election day, even if they're received after election day, because it's not hard to imagine if you're living overseas that mail can be delayed for a number of reasons. But it's just ludicrous. Part of this executive order is essentially disenfranchising service members, which is insane.
Well, and what's crazy to me about that is like, okay, so where does that come from? What are the roots of that? And it's so obvious. The roots of let's stop mail-in ballots, whether they're from, your grandparents who can't get to the polling location or military members at a military base in Germany or something. Let's stop them. Where does that come from? That comes from election night 2020 in Pennsylvania, where Donald Trump is leading and thinks he's going to win because he doesn't understand how any of this works. And then the mail-in and absentee ballots start coming in and, all of a sudden I lost. And he chalks that up to cheating instead of the normal process of how mail-in and absentee ballot works, which that's the root of that part of the order and all of this other stuff.
Keep in mind also, famously, Trump moved his residency from New York to Florida, right? Florida has a long-standing tradition of voting by mail. And actually, Republicans were the dominant group that voted by mail in Florida until Trump decided that mail voting was fraudulent. And guess who requested a mail ballot around that same time that they were saying mail ballot is fraudulent. Mail ballots are fraudulent.
Right.
Donald Trump.
But they're not fraudulent if you're voting for Trump, right?
Yes.
Like nothing, then it's all above board. Anything else though, we gotta check that stuff out. Anyway, so like what can people do like that are listening to this who are like, this is just crazy? I mean, how do you fight what seems like an unwinnable battle at times that's on like a lot of different fronts? Congress, White House issuing executive orders, state legislatures, things like the Georgia State Election Board, which is unelected. So there's nothing, we can't really get them out, all the way down to your local election board, which, as you well know, throughout Georgia and a lot of other places are rife with people who are part of the election denial movement. What can people do to like get involved and do something about all of this to make sure that elections remain free and fair?
Well, one thing I'll say is one of the big hallmarks of success that this far right election denial movement has had is that they've worked with the grassroots movement to essentially like recruit everyday people to get involved, just like you're saying. And so, we need almost like a mirror of that, but that is following the law and that is trying to protect free and fair elections instead of attacking it. And so one thing you could do is get involved with organizations like the one that I work for, Fair Fight/Fair Fight Action. We essentially try to educate the public about what's going on these things. We try and encourage folks to reach out to their local representatives, maybe on city council or your county seat holders. We encourage you to reach out to your local elections offices, but also your state legislators, your governor. Basically, just like get active, making your voice heard. Send an email, make a call, show up to a meeting. These things matter. And, I know it can feel time consuming sometimes, but we all just got to find any way we can to make an impact there. So if you can't show up to a meeting, maybe consider giving them a call, sending them an email. Right now, I would say the most important thing that you can do with the SAVE Act sitting in the Senate is to call, email, write a letter, whatever, contact
Yep.
both of your U.S. senators and urge them to vote no on the SAVE Act for all the reasons we've been talking about. But the chief reason is that it would disenfranchise 21 million Americans.
Yep. Yeah. I would say also get to your local election board meeting, because I'm telling you what, man, people who believe in election lies, they are at these meetings. Probably not as much now as they were, 3 and 4 years ago when I was starting to report on a lot of this stuff. But they are at these meetings and they are implementing policies that affect you right now. Like they are closing precincts and polling like they have the power to do that on like a minute level that like Trump executive order, whatever, they're never going to accomplish that. So anyway, okay, Max, where can people find your work and stay on top of what you're up to?
You can go to fairfight.com. You can sign up for emails. You can also follow Fair Fight Action on social media. Pretty much any platform you're on, we're on there with the handle @FairFightAction.
Awesome. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the American Doom podcast. This is just a part of what I do as a writer and journalist. If you want to keep up with everything I'm working on, head over to my Substack newsletter at american-doom.com. There you'll find the independent confrontational journalism that I think is so important for this fraught historical moment.